Hi everyone, it's Lauren and these are the reviews for all of the books that I read in the month of February. All of the links to everything I mentioned will be in the description box below if you find any of them interesting and fancy reading them for yourself. So the first book that I finished was Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee, and I was really excited to read this book because I knew it was going to be about Korea and Japan and Koreans in Japan, which is something, what do I know about? Nothing. So I was really looking forward to reading this. I was slightly disappointed, I've got to say, but on the whole, I think it's definitely worth giving it a read. So this follows a line of several generations of a Korean family who leave Korea in, I guess, the 1930s to travel to Japan. And it spans all of the years from that time through the Second World War, all the way up to sort of the 80s and 90s. And it really looks at how those societies were affected, how the people were affected by, the Japanese administrating Korea, and then also the Japanese involvement in the Second World War and what happened to Koreans in Japan after that, which was that they, even if they'd been born in Japan, essentially lost any hope of Japanese nationality or a Japanese passport. And it was very, very interesting to learn about what it was like for people in that society, because I didn't know anything about that. And as I was reading the book, I almost felt like I wanted to go away and research this more because it was absolutely fascinating. What I didn't enjoy about it is that I felt the characters were much more representative of Korean society and different types of Korean refugees or people who've been born in Japan, whatever it was. And it felt very allegorical and not really like these were characters that I got a chance to care about. And that was because you felt like you'd get to know a character and then quite abruptly 10 or 20 years would pass and they'd die or something would happen, and it just seemed to jump very, very quickly, and you didn't feel like you had time to really process any kind of grief for characters that died or any proper kind of sympathy for their spouses or children that were left behind. So it felt more like snapshots in time. So you had Sunja, who is a woman who's living in Korea. She finds herself pregnant, and luckily there is another Korean man who's on his way to Japan, and he says, I'll marry you anyway and I'll take you with me. So they go and settle in Japan, and then it's about the lives of her and her husband in Japan and their sons that are born, and then it's the way that those two sons, Noah and Mosasu, how they end up living their lives. Noah tries to assimilate into Japanese society and almost try and really work hard, and that was a really interesting factor, the idea of someone being a really good immigrant or a very industrious Korean and showing that Koreans can be just as good as Japanese people if only we worked hard enough. And Mosasu is more the victim of this discrimination and drops out of school and goes down to work in pachinko parlours. But then after that we start jumping spans of years a little bit more rapidly, and you see what happens to both of them, both of their children, and like everything that goes on right up until the present day. It did just feel like it was trying to be a bit too obvious in terms of this is Noah's path and he tried to do this, and this was Mosasu's path and he tried to do that, and yet they both faced discrimination, which, if you see what I mean, it just felt more like a metaphor than I was actually reading a book about these characters, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, which is why I still think it's worth a read, especially if you're interested in learning about that kind of society and that location and that time, which I had no knowledge of before. I would just go in understanding that it's more a rumination on people's lives and different paths that people's lives took within that society than it is a really, really character-driven story. Next I picked up We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This is my first ever Shirley Jackson. Heard a lot of good things and I felt like, yeah, we'll start with this one. It's got a lot of praise. I sort of enjoyed this. I really can't work out my full feelings on it. Essentially, this is the story of the Blackwood family. You've got Mary Catherine and her older sister Constance and their uncle Julian, who are all living in this house, which has been completely shut up because about 10 years ago or something like that, Constance was accused of murdering the rest of the family by arsenic, and she was acquitted. But since then, there's been a kind of black mark on their name, and the whole of the village shuns them and they shut themselves up in the house. And things that I really enjoyed about it is Mary Catherine as a character. She's very infantilized and very childlike, even though she's 18 years old. It's like she hasn't moved on from that point where that tragedy happens. And I really enjoyed the way she viewed the world and the way she kind of hides her own anxieties and fears by burying little things around the house. And she's so childlike in the way she views things, and also sort of obsessive compulsive in other factors as well. And she's trying to live in her own fantasy life, which she thinks will protect her. And I really liked that, and I liked that aspect of her narration and some of the ways her mind would work. I thought on the page it read extremely beautifully. I also was interested to find out what kind of happened with this mystery and kind of where the plot was going to go in terms of their relationship with the villagers. But at the same time, I was sort of bored. So I don't really understand how I can like something, but simultaneously not be that fussed about finishing it, really. I kind of was like, oh, I suppose I'll read it. And it's not even that long. Maybe I just wasn't in the mood for it. Or maybe I felt like I couldn't quite get a handle on what was going on, and I kept forgetting how old Mary Catherine was actually. At first I thought she was an adult, and then I thought, actually, is she an actual child? And then I'd forgotten that she'd said she was 18 at the beginning of the book. And I think perhaps I just didn't connect as quickly and as strongly as I could have right at the beginning, and therefore wasn't that enthused throughout the rest of the plot. But it's still, you know, it was still good. I'm really pleased I've read it, and I'm not going to write off Shirley Jackson now. I definitely like to read some of her other work, and perhaps the more I read of her, the more I get a sense of her style. So yeah, I guess a middle of the road sort of review for this one. Next was quite a quick read, but I picked up Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare, which I've never read before, and I have seen a performance of, which was very, very good, and I enjoyed it. And I wanted to read this for my next Shakespeare series video, which I will be doing in a few weeks' time, she says. And actually I very much enjoyed it. I found it very, very readable, and I don't know if this is just because of the type of plays that I'm reading now, or because I'm older, that I feel like I can read Shakespeare on a first read and understand what's going on and get the beauty of the language and sort of what's happening with the plot, but also I can kind of visualise it on stage as well, which I think is a blessing, because you start learning Shakespeare very, very young. Which in some ways is very good, but almost it feels like work when you're at school, because you don't just read a paragraph and understand what that means. You have to really work and ask the teacher and decipher all the words. So it's just a really nice experience now, I find, reading Shakespeare and just enjoying it rather than having to analyse it all. But I'm interested in doing the analysis, which I obviously will do before I shoot the video. So yeah, that was just nice, a little interlude. The next book I read was A Portable Shelter by Kirsty Logan, which is a book of short stories, but they have a through line. So this is two mothers who are telling their unborn baby stories. They've both decided that they're not going to tell the baby anything that isn't true. But the one who is pregnant tells the baby stories while her partner's at work, and then the other mother tells the baby stories while the pregnant one is asleep. So you get a little bit of their perspectives in between the stories, and how they love the baby and what they hope for the baby in his or her future, which I really liked. And then you get each of the stories themselves. And these I really enjoyed. They are set in modern day Scotland, but the feeling of them and how they're written has so many elements of fairy tale, not just in sort of magical things happening within the story, but also just the rhythm of the stories. And although they were very different, they really linked together very, very well, and they were all looking at this idea of truth within stories and how we look at our own lives, and whether, you know, you look back on an event and you tell it in a different way to how you felt as you were living it. So what makes it true? Is it true while you were living it, or is it true the way you tell it? And how can you tell people about the world, especially babies, if you want to teach them something true? Can you ever avoid telling them stories? And how much truth about ourselves and about the world are there in stories which might be make-believe themselves? So it was just really nice ponderings, and the stories themselves I thought were really lovely as well. That they're a little bit odd, a little bit dark, in the way that the best fairy tales are. And finally, a book I absolutely loved, finished the month off really well, and that was The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden. This is a proof, so it has a bit of an odd cover, but this is out now. It has been out for a while, and this is the third book in the Winter Night series. The first is The Bear and the Nightingale, and then you've got The Girl in the Tower, and this final one, and I absolutely loved it. I mean, at first, when I first started reading it, This follows on very, very swiftly from The Girl in the Tower, and at first I was like, what? I cannot remember what was happening. But ultimately, I really enjoyed it, and I think this trilogy honestly should be made into a film. This whole series is the story of Vasia, who's a young girl in sort of early medieval Russia, or before it is Russia, and she discovers that she has powers. She's the granddaughter of a witch. We have the rumours right at the beginning of the book, but she can see all of the little fabled creatures who guard the Russian houses, and she can see them, she can talk to them, all of the spirits of the wood, of the water, and so she knows that she's different right from early on. The first book is really establishing her as a person and her place within her family and in the world, and although there is some action, I wasn't too fussed about the first book. I thought it was fine and I liked the stories, but I wasn't really taken by it. And then The Girl in the Tower, it really felt like Vasia was out on her own. She was an adult almost. She was emancipated from everything and she was just gonna live her own life. And I really enjoyed that book because there was so much action. There's so much discussion of a woman's place, especially within that very, very restricted society. And I liked the comments on that, but also the comments on the world in general and religion and fear. So that was great. This is equally great. It follows on from that story straight in. I think this book really helps put the other two in perspective as well, because there's lots of magical things happening throughout this series and it's not always very well explained, I didn't feel, in the first book. And with this third one, I felt like, oh, I understand what's going on now. I understand how you're positioning these sort of spirits and gods and immortal beings and how you're positioning them against humans. I kind of understood how she was knitting it all together in this book. So I feel like people have different perspectives on this series as to whether they really enjoy the first one or they enjoy the second two. I'm very much in the camp of enjoying the second two more. So I'd love to hear from you what you've thought about this series. I honestly didn't think I was going to love it as much as I did, even after reading the first book. It's not a perfect book, like literary wise. There is a romance in here which I felt was a bit unnecessary, but also just not very well communicated maybe. I didn't really understand why those two characters liked each other. I didn't feel their connection. It felt like it was a love story for the sake of the plot rather than something that as a reader I was really egging on and wanting to happen. So, that's fine, but ultimately it's such an enjoyable read and really interesting as well, because it's something, Russian folklore is something I don't know very much about again. So I felt like I was learning something as well, and yeah, just overall really enjoyed it. So that was my February, which means that it's March. Yay! And also springtime. I literally can't believe it. How fast is this year going? Maybe it's just me because I'm an old woman now, but oh my god, honestly. I would love to hear what you've been reading over winter, over February, what you're most excited to read in March. We've got the Women's Prize long list, which was just announced, and I'm about to devour all of the books on that list. And what are you most excited to pick up soon? And I'll see you in my next video. Bye!